Well, welcome to the Father Show, and I'm your host, Mike Thompson. And before we get started, because man, let me tell you, we got a great show for you today. We have an excellent guest, and we're going to be talking about. Nah, I'm going to let you wait. But before we get started, if you have not subscribed to the show, please hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so that way you'll always be notified whenever we have another show up. And if you are a man and you are looking for resources, maybe even about what we're talking about today, go to the Father Show with MikeThompson.com. Click on resources, and there you will find resources that can assist you in whatever else that you may need. So I don't want you to miss out on anything, and I want you to enjoy everything that you got going on. But ladies and gentlemen, today we have a young lady on the show by the name of Katie Roach. And Katie is a relationship and sex therapist who believes that with the right tools, our relationships and our sex lives can be the containers in which we build the very best versions of ourselves. Now, she works with attachment style, performance anxiety, self-worth, and emotional intimacy. I want to dive right into this because I think it's a great subject, and I think it's something that we really need to talk about in our relationship. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's welcome Katie Roach. Katie,
Hello, how's it going?
it's great. How are you?
Good, good. That was a very exciting intro. I feel very welcomed, very important. So
You
I'm
are
glad to be
very
here.
important. Don't let
Glad you think
anybody
so.
ever tell you otherwise.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So you being in a profession that is, I don't know. Let me ask you, how did you get into this profession?
Sure. So it is actually kind of an interesting story. I'll try not to make it a huge part of our podcast today. I did my undergraduate degree in journalism, actually. And so I was
Okay.
writing about sex and relationships out of college. And eventually I sort of thought, I have some ideas about this. I've learned a lot through this. I think
Mm-hmm.
I would like to be one of the experts or one of the people working directly with clients instead of the person who is like always interviewing other people about it. And
Mm-hmm.
so this was sort of the logical next step for me. So I was like, I want to be a sex therapist, went to graduate school, got a master's degree, and here we are. So,
Okay. Good. Good. That's, there's not something that you would, you go home and tell your parents, what am I majoring in? Guess what, mom and dad?
and it did go like that. It was not an easy conversation to have. So you are correct.
Yeah, well, I have a few kids of my own, so I can imagine if they came to me and said, "This is what I'm gonna do, Dad," I'd be like, okay,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
well, that's good.
Right. A lot of questions of how did you get there and why are you interested in this?
Yeah, what made you
Which makes
go
sense.
that route?
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Which I think a lot of it, one thing we talk about in sex therapy a lot is that you can't ever just talk about sex. So many
right.
other things come up in sex therapy. Really, it's like a really good sort of lens or window into a lot of our other personality traits, stuff we struggle with. So for me, it was a lot about like, this is sort of it's a thing that touches everyone's lives. It's about what it means to be a person and
Yeah.
where we get stuck on that process. And so that was really, I think, the umbrella of what called to me. But you can imagine my dad's reaction being like, "Wait a second,
So yeah,
how did this happen?
yeah,
Are you okay?"
yeah.
So
That's not something I don't think too many fathers want their daughter to come tell them. This is
yeah,
what I'm going to be doing, Dad.
right, right,
Yeah, yeah,
right. I think now they get it. It's a little bit better now. They understand what sex therapy is because that's a confusing thing
yeah.
already. Is like what a sex therapist do. It's better now, but it was
Well, let
definitely
me
a struggle.
ask you, what does sex therapists do?
Right. So the biggest disclaimer we often have to give people when they're confused about what it is there's no touching in sex therapy. It is like I'm in my office right now, just like you imagine a therapist. It's a crowd. Um, we're sitting. I'm in downtown Chicago. So we're really working on sexual issues that arise for people. One of
Okay.
the ones that's very common, you mentioned in the intro, performance anxiety is a huge one.
Mhm.
We also talk a lot about sexual functioning issues. Sexual functioning is something that is a part of everyone's lives at some point. Like whether it's related to aging or anxiety, or other chronic health issues or acute health issues. So we talk about functioning. A lot of times what people think of is like essentially genital functioning,
Mm-hmm.
when things
Mm-hmm.
don't go the way you want them to, basically.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that like not a lot of our friends and family members will like freely mention that, oh, I'm struggling with this thing that's a part of my sex life. It doesn't really come up at like Thanksgiving. So people feel very alone. So it's a huge thing people come in with. Another major thing that we deal with in sex therapy is we call it desire discrepancy, which is
Okay.
one person has a higher desire and one person has a lower
Mm-hmm.
desire. It's a pretty universal experience. Sometimes it flip flops in couples, where they're sort of trading the lower desire position, especially after things like having
Yeah.
kids. That
Yeah.
can kind of like put a wrench in that for a little while. Really normal. But
Mm-hmm.
there's often somebody who's high desire and low desire then too. And so kids is another good example. We're often helping people kind of get back into a groove after having children.
Yeah, because it is. I know for men, sometimes when we in the birthing room and we see the baby coming out and we see all that, we're like, I
Right.
don't know if I can do that anymore because she just
Right.
pushed out a baby. So what am I going
Right.
to give her?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's sort of that adequacy that can come up, and also some trauma, right, for both
Yeah.
people around like that was a lot. Yeah, yeah. And adequacy is probably the number one thing I talk about with clients is perceived feelings of adequacy as it sort of comes to sex, and then like where we get that feeling that we have to be so adequate from, like why that's a thing in our culture.
Yeah, but do you think that is, I, I know it's socialized in our culture with,
Right.
you know, women saying, or you read one thing and the woman is saying, oh, he's got to do this and he's got to do that and he's got to satisfy me and he's got to be,
Right.
20 feet long and, all
Right.
that. And then you have a man, men don't really, I don't know, and I'm going to ask you because you're the professional. Does men really have a difference in making wanting to have sex or being connected to the person, or what is it? Because men, we react to sex differently. We can, sadly but true, we can
Sure.
go out and have sex with any woman and it didn't mean anything to us. It was just the action
Sure.
of doing it.
Right, right. Well, and that's interesting because I think something we also don't talk about a lot is that sex has a lot of different purposes. Like it's stress relief for some people, it's sexual release for some people. It's also bonding and connection. It's a way to feel closer to your partner. It's a way to resolve conflict sometimes.
Hmm.
There's a lot of different meanings that sex has, and most of us, all genders, which I think is often surprising that women can be this way too,
Yeah,
will
they
have
can.
it for different reasons.
Yeah.
Like it will fall into all of those categories, sometimes at the same time, sometimes at different times. So I think what you're talking about is, yeah, there's a difference between having sex with like a stranger or somebody you don't know very well for stress relief than it is to like try to connect emotionally with someone
Hmm.
during sex. I do think that the idea of like connecting emotionally during sex, people get this idea of like, like rose petals and jazz music, and it's like really romantic, but emotionally connecting is really more about being very present. There are some sex therapists who sort of talk about like feeling the person behind the skin. Like, are you even aware that there's another person with you? Which again, for all genders is not always the case.
Hmm. And it
So,
really is all genders. I
right,
know that a lot of society wise, they put the women over as the emotional. They want the attachment, and where men
right,
are the dogs in a sense, for the lack of a better way of putting
right,
it. But that's not always the case. And like you mentioned
right,
earlier, sometimes there's a crossover. I mean, where you have the man wants more connection and more intimacy, and the woman's just
yeah,
like, hey, let's just do it and get on out,
right,
do it and go home. We have, and today, just in case the audience haven't figured out, we're talking about really performance versus connection. So, and you kind of mentioned performance and connections are different. And
right.
men look at performance a little different than women. Can you tell us
Sure.
what men look for in performance?
Right. Like in like a female partner, what they're
Y-
expecting as far as
Yeah.
performance goes. I think a lot of it from men is they're wanting it to be very exciting a lot of the time. Like confidence is something that I hear from male clients a lot that they want from their female partners, like somebody who can initiate and be a little bit more overtly sexual. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's sort of this sort of like being experienced, kind of like coming to the table with a lot of I know what I'm doing kind of energy.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is less so than the kind of performance that we expect from men or that men expect from themselves, like on a cultural level around. I mean, you were mentioning this earlier, but there's a lot of things like can men last long enough so that the female partner can have an orgasm? Do they
Mm-hmm.
know where the clitoris is? There's, I think, a lot of disparaging remarks geared towards men around
Mm-hmm.
that kind of stuff. And so we see that kind of more concrete performance language. But it is interestingly reinforced more by men on themselves than it is with their longer term partners. For example, I think
Okay.
there's, in the sort of socialized culture with single people, they're a lot more likely to kind of like make those comments about the opposite gender around like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
here's what we expect. But it doesn't really show up that way when people are having sex,
Okay.
nor is it really helpful. So,
So when a woman is looking at having sex and she really wants that connection with the man, but it doesn't. They're not worried about the reaching an orgasm. And I know we can't put everybody in a box, so I
sure.
there's no all to anything.
Right.
So I want us to look at it and say, okay, well, women generally look for what in a relationship or a performance from a man.
Right. Right. And so if we talk about like performance, right? A lot of times what women are wanting, particularly in like a relationship standpoint, let's say somebody you've had sex with more than a handful of times, because both happen,
Hmm.
is like feeling like it is safe to make mistakes for both people, and feeling like if they give direction, like, hey, a little bit more this way, or try this instead, or this hurts, for example, or can we
Hmm.
switch?
Hmm.
They really want that to be safe, because that's sort of like an experiential learning process. Like one thing we say a lot with performance for all genders is that like sometimes skills are not that helpful because every person is going to have a different response to you. Like everybody experiences pleasure differently, everybody reaches orgasm differently. And so the skills are only going to take you so far. What you have to be able to do is sort of learn and adapt and not take feedback very personally, and sort of be willing to explore territory that you're not familiar with. And I don't just mean like kinky stuff, like
Okay.
that's great and that's
Yeah.
useful in its own way, but
But I think you hit
kind
a really a key point. Don't take it so personally.
right,
Because
right.
I think men will take it very personally. If you say, no, you're not doing it right,
Yeah,
hit me, go a little to the left or go a little to the right,
right.
they were like, well, wait a minute. Are you trying to tell me I don't know what I'm doing?
Exactly. Right, right. And so what happens then, right, is because we call that sort of like an ego response. Not like, oh,
Yeah.
men have these huge egos. We all have an ego and it is really concerned with our identity, like really concerned with you saying something that does not align with the way I see myself. And
Hmm.
so if that happens, right, if like let's say the man takes it personally when she's kind of giving feedback or saying, okay, that hurts, let's do something else. Well, he's like, okay, you're telling me I don't know what I'm doing? Like I know what I'm doing here, or it just feels bad. They feel shame. They often shut down. They like won't maybe adjust to the feedback. You can feel when somebody emotionally withdraws. Like you don't have to be a highly intuitive person to feel when somebody withdraws from an experience. And the message that sends the partner is like, you can't do that here. You don't get to give any feedback like that. Your partner is going to shut down. They can't handle that. And so there's sort of an emotional over responsibility that happens where
Hmm.
now the female partner, and this of course can switch genders, but the female partner in this example is like, I can't ever make my partner feel inadequate. I can never say
Hmm.
anything that makes them feel like they don't know what they're doing. And they're probably never going to orgasm. They're
Hmm.
probably going to really struggle with pleasure. And then the quality of sex goes down, which is really, really distressing for both people because
Hmm.
they feel like, why isn't this not working in the way that we want it to? Like, what's happening here? Why can't this seem to be good? So it gets really rigid. Like, the way it's happening becomes really formulaic. We're only going to do this position followed by this position, and this is how everything ends. So in a way, it's like a bad self-fulfilling prophecy. Like when you feel like, well, I know what I'm doing, and you're not going to be able to tell me that I'm not. I don't want to feel that way. We often then like really start to feel like we don't know what we're doing and we're not having a good time. So it's kind of a vicious cycle.
Now, is there something that you can tell or tell men that can keep them from feeling less worthy and less or hurting their ego when somebody or the woman
Right.
tells him, "Hey, let's switch it up a little bit, or let's do this." Is there something you
Right.
can advise men on what they can do or how they can not feel like they inadequate?
Yeah, yeah. I think there are a few things there. One of the really important first steps is recognizing that that's happening. Like if you can recognize I'm feeling a sense of shame, I'm feeling inadequate, that's a good sign of, okay, I think my ego is probably about to sort of arise. Like I think my ego is about to get in the way of me being able to like have sex productively. And so being able to notice that's happening is really important because then you can intervene. You're not going to just, we call it like responding instead of reacting. I can sort of remind myself that I'm not supposed to know everything. And that this might be a new partner or a partner I haven't explored very much with. How would I know their body? How would I know what's going to work just magically when every person's body is very different? We call that positive self-talk. So there's a self-reflection, positive self-talk piece. So one of those things that's really important is really internalizing that, like if we're using the female body as an example here, women experience pleasure and have orgasms in extremely different ways. There are
Mm-hmm.
women who need lots of pressure, for example, and women who don't want any at all. There are some women who can come from vaginal penetration by
Mm-hmm.
itself. It's a minority. It's only like 15-20% of women who can do that without clitoral contact. Some people need both at the same time. It's so varied that there's no way any person could know early sexual experiences what to do that would work. It just is not possible. And it's much worse to not have any curiosity about what works than it is to feel like, oh, I don't really know. I don't know your body yet. So that's a huge piece, I think.
So you would say that it would be better for a man to learn how to, in which our other part of our conversations, connect with
Right.
partner and say, okay, what is it that you like or what is it you don't like, and be
Right.
very open and be able to take the criticism, the direction,
Yeah.
and figure out what she wants, because I think all women have it, we all have had different experiences. We've all had
Right.
trauma in our life, and
Yes.
those things can affect their sexual desire and what they like and don't like.
Yeah.
How can we help, men to be able to understand or talk or connect with the woman before you're worried about, am I performing at my top, at my peak, really making
Right.
her happy?
Yeah. So there are conversations you can have outside of sex, for example. Sometimes it's after sex and between sex, is being able to say, like, what did you like? What did you not like? I really liked this part. What were you into? And that's a way of connecting. It's also a way of, I call it just gathering data, which sounds
Hmm.
like very clinical, but is really important. Is like, I need data to
Yeah.
be able to do this well. So you're giving me data. During sex itself, you're using verbal and nonverbal language. Like if you touch someone in a specific way, and they either are like, oh, I don't like that, or move this way, that's verbal feedback, and you would adjust and say, okay, how's this, or does this work here, what if I do this, how's this pressure? But you can also pay attention too to like, how does she respond? Like if people tense up,
Hmm.
a lot of times where you feel like, okay, they didn't like that, let's move this way. And there is sort of that non-judgmental curiosity that's happening. Judgmental towards yourself, that's a big one. Like, okay, well, she didn't like that, it's not because I'm a total failure, it's because I'm learning. I'm learning this person's body. And non-judgmental towards the other person, because that's something that can happen. Is like, if you feel like I really need to be able to perform well, this is really important that I do a good job, like for my identity, you're going to be a lot less, you're just not going to be as likely to like be able to hear what they're saying and make
Okay.
adjustments. Like it becomes really, really difficult to hang in there. Um, and you're never again going to get any valuable data. And so non-judgmental, we don't want to be like, well, why isn't my partner responding the way I want them to? I did this thing, she should like it, and now I'm judging her because
Yeah.
what's wrong with her? That's like that whole Freudian idea of like when they used to call women frigid,
Hmm.
and they would say, oh, she's just sexually frigid, she's not responsive. And it turned out that Freud actually literally didn't know where the clitoris was. He just didn't know that it was
Okay.
really a thing. So that was a real thing that happened in history. But yeah, we don't want to do that to our partners either. And that can happen again. Women do that to men all the time as well. So it's certainly not like a male ego problem.
Okay. and women will do that and say different things that will. I don't know. I think you would want a for a man's point of view, you would want your woman to encourage you in a
Right.
way instead of,
Right.
well, you didn't really do that right, and I wasn't feeling that tonight. But
Right.
as I tell people, it's not always what you say, it's how you say it.
Absolutely. Right. Right. And that's a huge problem too. We do a lot of that in couples therapy as well, which is like, how do you constructively bring a complaint to the table? And a lot of times during sex, it's actually not even a complaint. It's, if you're saying like move to the left,
Hmm.
that's not a complaint at all. That's just saying, okay, it's really a command or a direction.
Yeah.
But yeah, if a woman says to you during sex, and speaking of trauma, like that was terrible, or you did that wrong, or like that was like you didn't impress me, basically,
Yeah.
you're never going to feel emotionally safe enough to make any changes, to learn as you go. You're going to feel a lot of pressure of, oh, that didn't go well, we're not connected at all now. So
And when
that
you
does
have
happen.
that kind of pressure, it will, in my estimation, it will cut down on the quality of sex and the
Right.
quantity of sex, all that. Because if I don't think I can please you, then why am I going to even try?
Yeah, what's the point, right?
Yeah.
What's the point? And what's the point of having it at that point? I know we talked about desire discrepancy.
Hmm.
Culturally, we have this idea that it's usually the female partner who has low desire, which can happen. I see about 50-50, whether it's the male or female who's high desire or low desire.
Hmm.
But this is a way that men can end up with low desire, is because if they feel like they're not only are they not going to succeed, but they're not having a good time anymore. Like it's not enjoyable. There's no quality. It doesn't make any sense to desire sex. It would be illogical to want it, and so that happens a lot too. And that can create a whole other shame spiral for men, because we talk about socialization. They really think I'm supposed to want sex all the time.
Hmm.
This isn't masculine, maybe, and of course it does make sense in that context.
And when you mention socialization, I know in the male world, we look at performance and we look at really doing, you know, making her eyes curl up in her head and, things of that nature.
Right.
And we think that a lot of men can just have sex with anybody at any time for no reason whatsoever, just
Sure.
to have it. But I
Right.
have talked to men that will not really have sex. They want the connection with the
Yeah.
woman. They don't want to just have sex, unmeaningful sex. They want a connection with
Right.
their partner. You hear a
Right.
lot about that, or you see a lot of men that put that
Yeah.
way?
Absolutely. Some of that, certainly not all of it. I think an important caveat before I go into this is that one thing that can impact drive, particularly in men, is levels of testosterone. So some men have naturally a lot of testosterone. Sometimes that creates higher drive in general, where they feel little bit more like I could just have sex with anyone. But sometimes other emotional factors come into that. It's hard to gauge your motivations for things sometimes. Like for all of us, hard to know why we do certain things.
Hmm.
And so we tell ourselves consciously, I'm doing this, right? Let's talk, like if we're talking about sex, I love sex, right? That might be what a man says who goes and has a lot of it. And he might say, that's why I do this. But a lot of us also who maybe are sleeping with a lot of people, for an example, sometimes it can come from a place of, is this how I get some level of validation or some level of status? It can be hard to tell if it's drive, like I genuinely want to have sex, or is it serving another purpose for
Hmm.
me? And so sometimes, like, all these factors converge. Sometimes if a man says I prefer to connect, it can mean a lot of things. It can mean that he's just a more, like, maybe in touch with his emotions. It can mean that he's sort of equated quality with like having a connection with someone. And it could to some extent also be that he feels really, really like that's not how I'm getting any validation for my masculinity.
Hmm.
Like I don't really need to go do that. It also might just be this that's not the way I learned how to cope with stress, as an example. So there's a lot that goes into it.
Yeah.
There isn't really one right way of being for anyone, since there are so many of these factors.
And I think that's a key statement there. There is no one way of doing it.
Right.
And I
Right.
know with men, especially young men, when you're in high school and college and you're mid to late 20s, it's a lot of times it's about the bragging right, the masculinity of it. And
Right.
if you don't want to have sex, other men will look at you like,
Right.
yeah, you're weak, you know.
Yeah. Like, what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
Kind of messaging that they get. Yeah. And the truth is that a lot of those people who are giving that feedback probably also struggle with it sometimes, and they just don't want to talk about it because they feel weak. This is a really, as far as like as much sex as we see on TV and stuff, culturally we really don't talk about what is really happening with people's sex lives. Like, it's either too taboo, they feel like it's too private, or they're embarrassed. There's a lot
Hmm.
of shame around
Hmm.
this as a topic. Hard to know
Because,
what people are doing.
right, because I know religion plays a part in it, how you were
Right.
raised and your religious belief.
Yeah. Yeah, plays a huge role. Absolutely. And what you think is okay. There's that shame piece again. Like, is this a
Yeah.
bad tendency that I have? And that's something, it's kind of a loose trend so far. I haven't seen, since I haven't seen a lot of research to back this up yet. But with younger generations, like when I work with millennials and Gen Z, for example,
Hmm.
I do see a lot more couples where the female partner is the high desire partner. They're the ones who are feeling like, hey, why aren't we having more sex kind of thing. There's a lot less sexual shame. Religion plays somewhat of a role in that. Just the way, like the role that religion plays in culture now is a little bit different.
Hmm.
There's a lot else that went into repression past decades that's sort of easing up all the time. But that's a trend that we can track, is how people feel about sex and how rigid those roles are as some of the shame around sex starts to dissipate.
And men really, isn't there a time in their life, and I know testosterone level makes a big difference, but
Sure.
your I want to put this, your volume of sex desire changes as you get
Yeah.
older.
Right. Right. And that's something that happens with, again, all genders.
Hmm.
Because so there's a very famous sex therapist who died last year named David Schnark. He used to write a lot about this, um, where he would talk about how your biological drive for sex peaks in like your early 20s, which is kind of depressing, like in terms of hormones and stuff. Like
Hmm.
the drive out of, we call it horniness, that being the drive for sex, peaks in your early 20s, and then it pretty much starts to go down 25 and later. And so that's kind of depressing when you think about it that way. But he would talk about how your like erotic capacity, so your ability to have good sex, your ability to prioritize it, to grow through it, only increases throughout your life. And so he would sort of talk about how there's this bottleneck where you can't always rely on being like traditionally horny. And I use
Hmm.
that word because I think it like really viscerally encompasses this idea of like, you would call it like being struck by lightning. Like, I'm just in the mood all of a sudden. Where did that
Right,
come from?
right.
And you get older and you have to rely more on wanting to connect with your partner in an erotic way, which doesn't need to again be romantic. It doesn't always need to be rose petals and jazz music. A lot of times that still is really sexual in nature, but it becomes, this is important to me, and
Hmm.
so I'm going to make time and space for it, instead of I'm waiting for my body to tell me that this is what I should be doing. So that I think is really positive look at aging and how our hormones change and how they kind of make us grow a little bit, force us
Hmm.
to mature.
And also that would be your health, I would think, plays a part
Yes.
of it as well.
Yes. Yes. Your health plays a huge role in sex, because the hormones that you need, like for even for women, this happens a lot during menopause and premenopause. The change in hormones impacts things like lubrication and drive, and men are dealing with testosterone. And a lot of, like their heart health is really important because it's your vascular system.
Hmm.
And your vascular system plays a role in erections. So that's really important too. Um, but even before these like age, right, before we think about menopause and middle age and stuff, like there are lots and lots of men and women in their 20s who have dysregulated hormones because we live in a world where we don't always take the best care of our health. It's not always
Yeah.
possible. And so if any of those hormones are out of sync, like for a woman, having high estrogen, for example, can cause
Hmm.
low drive. um, the hormonal birth control pill can cause low drive. Antidepressants can cause low drive. Like blood pressure medication. There's a
Hmm.
lot of stuff even in the pharmaceutical world that impacts us. It's a very, very specific neuro cocktail that helps with drive. So health is huge when it comes to sex.
Would a man that has low testosterone, is it worth him going to get shots for increases testosterone level?
If he needs to, yeah, definitely. A lot of times in sex therapy, the first thing we're doing is we're referring to doctors. We're saying, hey, go get this checked. Like, we call it a rule out, is like making sure, I don't want to do 6 sessions, right, with somebody who just has low testosterone when they could really quickly fix that.
Hmm.
So it could be the shots that they use. Sometimes doctors will use a more holistic approach too, and they're working on lifestyle factors that impact things like testosterone level. One example is like the chemicals and cleaning products. Like Febreze is a good example of that can impact people's testosterone and hormonal
Really?
levels. So they can do a lot with their lifestyle to get some of those back. Like exercise increases testosterone. So
Hmm.
if that man is not already exercising, that's a really easy fix. They can go back to the doctor later. Are my testosterone levels back up? And we'll reevaluate from there. So it is always worth going to talk to a doctor because it's good to check up on that stuff anyway.
Yeah. Because I didn't know Febreze. Well,
Yeah, yeah.
wow.
Um, there was reading a study recently. There's somebody who it was a man who had developed gynomastia. I think that's the full medical term. Breast growth on men,
Uh
breast
huh.
tissue growth, and
Hmm.
and they had figured out it was because he was spraying Febreze into his car before he got into it every day. And once they removed the Febreze,
Really?
so I don't say that to demonize. I'm not like anti-cleaning product or
No,
chemical
no,
or anything,
no.
but we're getting a sense for how our environment impacts our health as we go. And so
Right.
there are a lot of sex therapists who are also doctors, and they're always talking about this stuff and in like the professional organizations and stuff around like, okay, we're
Yeah.
pinpointing stuff that's impacting testosterone levels as an example.
Well, yeah, because as you mentioned, even the medication that you may take, your health,
Yeah.
the foods you eat
Foods you eat are
is also as
huge.
important.
Right, right. The foods you eat are crucial, especially for energy, thyroid functioning, like ovarian functioning. There's a lot of stuff that nutrition is very therapeutic for as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I found that as I was kind of preparing a little bit for the show, I found that, and I was really kind of surprised that you have certain food. And one I saw was really shocking was what was it? It was celery,
Oh yeah.
and I was like, "What? Really?"
Right, right. Did it tell you why celery?
It might have, but I didn't have a chance to read it. I just kind of
Sure.
glanced at it real quick.
Sure. I have not heard celery yet, so I'm going to have to go look that one up later. Because a lot of times we're talking about nutrient levels when it comes to this stuff and the quality of your food and how it
Hmm.
impacts you. Um, so celery, I'm interested to see if it's like its mineral content or what it is about celery.
Yeah, because I have no idea. I plan on looking it up myself
Right.
because I want us to do more shows around sex and connecting with our spouse. And we've got the holidays coming up, and you're going to connect one way, but you got Valentine's Day coming up, and
Right.
that we want to connect and we want to be our best. And I know a lot of men really want to always be the best lover for their woman
Sure.
that they can possibly be. They don't want the wife or the spouse to say, uh, you know, I've had better.
Yeah. Well, that would be mean. That would be cruel to say to your spouse. That's a whole problem by itself.
Yeah. And you deal with that, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Criticism is a huge, we call it one of the four horsemen in couples therapy, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. They're named by John Gottman, who's a relationship researcher and expert. And they're criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. So those can show up in sex and they can show up in your relationship. And they have a huge impact on things like attachment and emotional safety and the inherent vulnerability needed to have quality sex anyway. And so that's a good
Hmm.
way to shoot yourself in the foot is to be mean to your spouse.
Hmm.
It's never going to improve if that happens.
That's a very good thing. I mean, even for men, because men shouldn't go to the wife and say, if you would do this to me, I would love you more.
Right.
If you would do that, I would love you
Right.
more. If you would instigate sex more, it would make me happy. I wouldn't go out and cheat, you know.
Right. Right. Yeah. How's that for pressure
Yeah.
and for feeling disconnected from
Yeah.
someone? Yeah.
So to connect with your spouse, you really have to spend the time to sit down and talk with them and
Yeah,
and connect with them and find out what they need and what their desires are.
right.
Now, so when would you say, okay, you're just starting off in a relationship?
Sure.
When, how far would you get into the relationship before you start having those conversations?
Well, I mean, ideally, some of that's happening from the first sexual encounter. Like the
Okay.
first time you have sex with a person, there is the ability to accept feedback. Say, okay, yeah, I'm doing this now. Or do you like this? Or how does this feel? And
Yeah.
it's still, you don't want to, I don't think, have like after the first time you have sex with somebody, a massive interrogation afterwards. But it's fine after sex to be like, oh, I really liked this. Like, what was your favorite part? Like, that's okay pretty much right away.
Yeah.
You kind of build on that as you go and you go
Okay.
from there and you kind of talk about it more in between sex. But in terms of having that mindset of like learning and growing, being curious instead of judgmental towards yourself or your partner from day one, because that's going to, there's a very popular book called Magnificent Sex. It's by Peggy Kleinplatz. Highly recommend it. It was written for clients. It's so good.
Okay.
And it's a like really comprehensive study on people answering like what made the best sex of your life good. And none of it, none of the research, they did it with people who are married for decades, with people who are just having casual sex. None of it was about positions or performance or genital functioning. It was all about being able to be uninhibited, able to
Okay.
feel emotionally, feeling authentic and honest. And like that stuff does not require you to have a good performance, and bringing that environment in the first time is only going to make the quality go up, which sort of serves your purposes early in a relationship. Like,
Mm-hmm.
well, yeah, we hopefully we enjoy this and want to keep doing. It makes people feel safe and seen, and that's really crucial immediately.
Okay. And you might have answered this, but I want to ask it anyway. What is the biggest misconception people have about what makes sex good?
So in my opinion, and this is based on, I know I'm name dropping some amazing sex therapists here, but these should be some good resources for your audience if they want to read more. A guy named Marty Klein wrote a book called Sexual Intelligence that's also really amazing. And he talks a lot about how we think in our culture that in order for sex to be good, we have to perform well. And that in order to like have high quality sex that we enjoy and get a lot of pleasure from, we have to have all these skills, we have to be impressive. And he was saying that's the wrong focus. We should be focused on pleasure and connection, not performance, not orgasm, not all the other little benchmarks that validate us or our partners. It's really about focusing on, are we feeling good? Do we feel connected? And letting the sort of quality rise from there. And so, that kind of study I was just talking about and what makes sex good, that's really the biggest misconception, is that
Yeah.
people think that you need to read Cosmo and know all the positions, or read GQ and know all of the like cool tricks, that you have to be impressive. You don't have to be impressive for sex to be good. That's not true at all.
Okay.
Which I think is a big relief for most of us. Like, oh, I don't have to focus on that at all, and it will just keep getting better on its own.
Well, what would you tell a man now that how he could, I mean, you've grown up with this, put in your head that you have to
Right,
perform, you have to be this, you have to be
right.
that. What could you say to men right now that would help them eliminate that, way of thinking?
Yeah. Well, really, what we're talking about with this is the capacity to be vulnerable, which is really hard for men. Again, we
Yeah.
socialize men that way. Like, as soon as they hit puberty, you're not allowed to be vulnerable. Stop that. So this is really hard. It's like it's like a light switch. Like you've sort of taken all of this out of you, and then you get into a serious relationship, or you start having sex, and they're like, "Be vulnerable," and you're like, "What? How? Like, how am I supposed to do that?"
Yeah.
And vulnerability is really required for this, like to be able to show to be able to like be willing to learn, which means you're going to sometimes, we call it failing upwards. You're not really failing, but you're sort of like experimenting. It's like the whole, Thomas Edison tried to make the light bulb like 10,000 times or something before he got electricity right. You're like allowing yourself to make mistakes. So in order to incorporate vulnerability, you have to start small. I usually recommend with men that you practice being vulnerable. Being seen is really what that is, for exactly who you are, you think you should be. Small pieces at a time. Does this feel
Okay.
safe? Is this a safe person? Because you mentioned like early in a relationship, right? You don't always
Hmm.
know if the person you just started dating is a jerk or not yet. You don't know if it's safe to be vulnerable with them. You'll get really good feedback if you start dipping your toes in that, engaging their response to you. And that's a good indicator of, I can't be vulnerable here. We're going to hit so many bottlenecks that are going to be problematic down the road. It's maybe not a good partner. With a long-term partner, this is much easier to start practicing being seen a little bit at a time.
Okay, I think that's great advice because you will, find men that will, well, and even women that when
Right?
they see their husband or their spouse or their boyfriend being vulnerable, it turns them off
Right.
because they don't they have a different view of what a man should be and
That
vulnerable.
masculinity.
Right. So
Right.
what they were brought up
Right.
with and what they were taught. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right.
But Katie,
I hear
thank you
that.
so much. Unfortunately, and I told you before we even started the show that this probably go long.
It's a
But
conversation you can have for hours, right?
it is. It really is. I mean, I hate to even cut it off right now because there's so many other questions I have and ideas. But hopefully, I can get you to come back on the show again, and
Absolutely.
we can continue this conversation. But for now, how can and you're in Chicago area, correct?
Yes, I'm in Chicago.
Okay. How can the people in Chicago get in touch with you and reach out to you if they should need to sit down and talk to you, whether as an individual or as a couple?
Yeah, so my email address is katie at relationshipreality312.com. Our website is relationshipreality312.com, and you'll find me there with my email address and my phone number. So that's probably the best way to get in touch with me is just to shoot me an email, especially if you're in the Chicago area or in Illinois, and you're wanting to be a client. We also have a couple other sex therapists on staff here. So right now, that's probably the best way to get in touch with me is to shoot me an email. And if you want to leave a voicemail, my phone number's on our website.
Okay. All right, great. And I really hope that the men will take advantage of it. And we really have a lot of women watch the show as well. So I will
Yeah,
hope
yeah,
that,
that's great.
yeah, I want them to reach out to you as well. Should they think they need you, should they need to talk, because it is a subject matter that is can ruin a marriage, ruin a relationship, and
Yes, it
it
can.
doesn't have to be that way. So
Right.
before they get to that point, I will hope they will reach out to you if they're in the Illinois area and contact you and get the advice and so they can have the best relationship that they can possibly have.
Yes. And
Yeah.
if they're not in Illinois, hopefully this will help them not be afraid of sex therapy and they'll be more willing to reach out to a sex therapist in their state.
Right. Because it is a kind of a taboo and it
It is
shouldn't be.
taboo.
Yeah. And I know
Right.
in my
Right.
generation it's probably even more so.
Right. Right. Where, yeah, we're definitely seeing that change as the generations go by.
Yeah.
So it's a little different now, but I hear you.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to be our show for today. And I really want to thank you for joining us. And I really want to thank Katie Roach for coming on the show and providing all that great information because it really is fantastic news, fantastic, information that we can help ourselves. And, really, as men, we have fathers, well, we have sons and daughters, and to be able to sit down with them and talk with them is something that's going to be because depending on the age we know we're going to talk to them about the birds and the bees anyway, so to be able to talk to them and have a good conversation and an intelligent conversation around sex is key. But if you haven't subscribed to the show, please go to the our YouTube channel, The Father Show with Mike Thompson YouTube channel. Hit that subscribe button, and while you're there, hit that notification bell. And as I mentioned earlier in the show, if you need resources to help you or to assist you in your life, go to the Father Show with MikeThompson.com and click on resources. And there you will find people like Katie, and hopefully we can even get Katie on our resource page. And that way you can always have somebody that you can contact and get the information that you need and that you want. So I thank you for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you next week. So until then, God bless, have a great time, and enjoy sex as much as you can, the best way you can, to so you can enjoy your life and your spouse's life. All right. God bless you.